Hey guys, welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing Hasan Minhaj's 2017 special Homecoming King. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. So a little bit of background. Hasan Minhaj rose to prominence for his role in The Daily Show. This is his first and so far only stand-up special, but he has since got his own weekly show on Netflix, Patriot Act. I've never seen any of his work before. I was kind of vaguely aware of who he was, but I've never got around to watching any of his stuff. His style is mostly observational comedy and storytelling, but with all of that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. Hasan starts the show with a little bit of an introduction, but he keeps it brief and pretty quickly gets into the first bit, where he talks about getting married. He tells a bit of a story, there are some good jokes mixed in with it. He could maybe use some more jokes in with the story, but he still keeps it funny. He quickly moves on to talking about having immigrant parents. There's some audience interaction in this bit that goes really well. It's really funny in parts. My only negative would be that sometimes there's a little bit too much build-up. But in terms of the story itself, there's a lot of quick-fire jokes told around it and also to help form the story. And he does this for a few different stories that he kind of jumps around between in this bit. There's a fairly short bit about one of his birthdays, which is really funny, and kind of bleeds into him talking about his family. One thing he does a few times throughout this bit is he'll bring the tone down a lot, like he'll mention something quite emotional and something quite sad, but then he'll instantly lift it with a really great joke. And it's a difficult thing to do well, to kind of bring the mood down like that in the middle of a bit, but he does it really well. He then builds up a story quite a bit, but it's a really funny story and it really pays off at the end. And one thing he does really well is he'll tell a story that's funny on its own, but he knows how to enhance it with jokes and not to overpower the story or to fill it in with jokes that aren't as funny as the story itself. He's really good at combining the two together to really make it a lot funnier than it already would have been. He's really good at writing bits, but not embellishing them too much. He spends a little bit of time talking about the differences between Hindus and Muslims. I didn't find this bit particularly funny. It was more to set up the next bit, but for me it just went a little bit too long. Although at one point he did make a great reference to the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks, which a lot of the audience didn't seem to get, but I thought it was very well done, and I got a good laugh out of it. But as I said, this was kind of to build up to him talking about his wife, and in this bit there were certain cultural references that I definitely missed. He also talked about some very serious topics and made some serious points. And he does well to still keep it funny, but it's not as good as it could have been. Again, there was a lot of cultural references spread throughout that I just didn't understand. But the whole tone of this bit was a little bit too serious in my opinion. But what he does really well afterwards is that he'll make it seem like he's continuing on a very serious note. He kind of tries to keep the tone throughout this transition, but then he completely changes tone and starts talking about landlines. And, he starts off with some really great shorter jokes in there. But then he quickly changes tone and gets really serious again, and it's a little bit weird because I can understand him bringing you down to then bring you back up in that way, but then to bring you straight back down just doesn't really work very well in my opinion. He tells a story about his family being racially targeted after 9/11, and he delivers it really well. It's not very funny, it's probably not the kind of message to give out in a comedy show, but it is really important, and it's hard to say anything negative about him touching on racism and telling a story like that. And he does start telling some jokes whilst trying to make his point, and he tackles the issue of racial prejudice really well and makes it funny within the second half of a bit. And it's a difficult thing to do, and like I said, should you mention it in a comedy show? Yes. Does he perhaps dwell on it a little too long or spend too much time without jokes? Probably. But it's really hard to mark someone down for making a point of talking about racial prejudice in this way. And he does make it quite funny in the second half of the bit. He goes on to talk about his first girlfriend, I guess, although maybe not first girlfriend. He tells some stories and they're really well told and really funny. He uses a little bit of performance, which is probably unnecessary, but it doesn't hurt the bit. It doesn't necessarily add anything, but it doesn't take anything away either. Again, he gets quite serious at parts and brings down the tone, but he mixes in some jokes. But the tone of the show in this bit, and kind of throughout the second half of the show, is very up and down all the time, and it works well when he does it a few times, or when he only does it for a very brief period. But it's just very up and down here, and it's hard to really know how you're feeling when he's talking about such a serious topic in such a serious way, and then suddenly making a few silly jokes and trying to get a laugh. He breaks it up with a really funny story about his first time headlining a comedy show, and this is a really nice relief from the bits before and after it. It's a really great story. But then he immediately drops the tone, talking about his dad's heart attack. And there's nothing funny in this bit. Obviously it's something very personal and important to him, and it's mostly used to set up the next bit, but it's still not really necessary. In the next bit he talks about his Pizza Hut advert, and he brings the tone up really well here. He does a good job of transitioning from the more serious story about his dad into a more light-hearted bit. And he tells the story with some shorter jokes in to break it up. And it's quite a funny story on its own, but the jokes really enhance it and improve it. He gets a little bit serious again at times in this bit, but it's used to build up to a joke and it doesn't really affect it. The final bit in the show is a story about him getting onto The Daily Show. This is a really well written and really well told story. It's not particularly funny on its own, but he puts in jokes often enough that you're constantly laughing throughout this bit. The last joke of the show is really great, but my only problem will be that the joke before it was a lot better in my opinion and would have been a much better ending to the show. It was still a really good ending, but when you've got an even better way to end the show immediately before it, it just felt a little bit weird to me. But it was still a good way to end. A few extra things worth mentioning. In terms of callbacks, Hasan uses them really well to enhance jokes. He keeps them very short and doesn't really emphasise them at all, but he does it in a really good way where he gets the extra laugh without ever acknowledging that he is calling back to something. His transitions are completely seamless. He moves from one bit to the next fluently. There's never any cut or awkwardness between bits. But it's still fairly obvious how the show is split up into different bits. And just in general, the whole show is really well written. Hasan also has a screen at the back of the stage, and he uses it really well to help illustrate a joke or part of a story. At times he's able to cut down on time setting up a joke or getting through a story, and it improves jokes in certain places. But he's also not over-reliant on it. He uses it really well to add something to the show without making it a major feature. It's still more about what he's saying, and you only ever really glance at the screen. As for the audience, he gets really good reactions throughout the special. All of the audience participation goes down really well. He gets really good responses, the kind he was looking for. They react pretty much how you would expect them to throughout the special, and they really add something to the show in a nice way. It's a really great crowd for a comedy show. Moving on to some overall thoughts, this is a really, really great show. Hasan knows how to write a show and his performance and delivery are spotless. Several times throughout the show he gets really serious for a few seconds, but he immediately switches to a great joke, and it's really well done and he always has perfect timing with it. He makes a lot of cultural references throughout the show that I just don't understand, so certain parts undoubtedly go over my head. But he also spends a lot of time on really serious topics, and I know I've mentioned it a lot already, so I'll try not to stay on it for too long. But I completely understand the need to make these points and to talk about racial prejudice and the problems people face. But there is a way to do it within a comedy show, and Hasan does it really well throughout the show. He just does it a little bit too much to keep the show funny throughout. He just does it a little bit too much in the show to keep it funny overall. So I just want to make it clear that I'm not marking him down for talking about those issues, but I think he keeps the tone down for too long considering that it is a comedy show after all. I'm finding it quite hard to give a rating. I really enjoyed the show, but there were a long period of times without a laugh. I'm going to go with a 7 out of 10. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter @standupreview and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day and we'll see you for the next episode.